Ahoy! Before we get into the video, let's start with a quick demonstration of the build. During the various beta phases for Diablo, I leveled the Necromancer twice. While doing so, I specifically avoided looking anywhere else for information or opinions on the Necromancer, because I wanted to form an opinion purely on my experience in the game and how different abilities performed. Because of that, in my first playthrough, I ended up with Corpse Explosion, because that was just ridiculously broken at that point, and I found out later that a lot of people had actually chosen that path as well, because it was just a bit stupid. But while this build was pretty broken against most mobs, it still had a weak point, which was bosses, where you just wouldn't get enough corpses to effectively use that build to the same extent. There were ways around it, but it just didn't feel ideal. So in the server slam, I tried to find a build that can fill the gap for this weakness while still making effective use of Corpse Explosion, and I will say I was pretty successful finding one. Another problem during the early phases of the server slam was that the skeletons died extremely quick on bosses, which was later fixed, but I figured I'm gonna use a build that also works well enough without skeletons when it comes to bosses. At the same time, I didn't want to lose the extremely fast mob clear that the Corpse Explosion build had. I wanted to have something that can also clear large groups very easily. Enter the Bone Zone. More specifically, Bone Spear. This core skill has extremely high base damage, and along with that, with an upgrade, you can also get return damage on additional projectiles that come back to you. It also happens to pierce through enemies till the end of your screen, so you can massively chunk large mob groups with it. This is, no pun intended, the core of our skill tree, but it will still be supplemented by Corpse Explosion, which deals with the cleanup after Bone Spear. Since Bone Spear is a line ability, it doesn't always hit all enemies effectively, and Corpse Explosion doesn't cost any resources, it's very spammable, and you will have plenty of corpses on the ground after Bone Spear has gone through there, so you just clear up the rest by blowing up the corpses that are laying around everywhere. But there's more to the build, especially when it comes to vulnerability, so let's have a look at it. First skill here is Bone Splinters. Fire 3 Bone Splinters dealing 8% damage each. So these are just small projectiles that are thrown. You're not even leveling this because it's not really necessary. You can if you'd like to, but it's not that much extra damage. Also, each subsequent time an enemy is hit by the same cast of Bone Splinters, you gain 1 essence. But additionally, you also have the generate 6 essence, so this is a pretty nice way to regain essence, especially on bosses, and this is going to be important. The upgrade Enhanced Bone Splinters gives us even more Bone Splinters, 25% chance to fire 2 additional projectiles if you have 50 or more essence. As far as I can tell, those additional projectiles should also increase your chance to gain more essence, because you can hit more enemies with more projectiles and so on, you get the idea. When it comes to the last upgrade, both are interesting in their own ways. One is hitting the same enemy at least 3 times with the same cast of Bone Splinters grants 8% critical strike chance for 4 seconds, which I think is generally a good thing to have. Or you can go for Acolyte's Bone Splinters, which gives you a 20% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. There's a reason why I prefer the crit option though. If we move down here to the core skills, and we look at our Bone Spear, which we absolutely want to max out with 119% pierce damage. Then we can go on, we have Enhanced Bone Spear here, which makes the Bone Spear break into 3 shards, which return with 25% damage each. And then we go up to Supernatural Bone Spear, which makes the first enemy hit vulnerable for 3 seconds. This, with how often you can spam Bone Spear, in my opinion, is a much more reliable way to apply the vulnerable effect. And because you can apply vulnerable to enemies so consistently, I like building my build around that. I used a lot of gear that deals extra damage against vulnerable targets because it's so easy to apply, and you will have it for all of your projectiles against any tankier enemy. Everything else falls down immediately anyways, so you don't have to worry about that, but if there's one slightly beefier enemy, they're gonna be vulnerable all the time and take a lot more damage all the time. Notice that this also has a 50% lucky hit chance and an essence cost of 25, which is not all too much to be honest, so you can spam this quite a fair bit. But we're also going to get some additional skills. Like I said, Corpse Explosion is still a nice skill to have because it deals with the stray mobs around. And this is still 50% base damage without any kind of resource cost. So this is very easy to use as long as there are corpses on the floor, and you're never going to use all of those corpses for skeletons. So yeah, it's a very effective perk to have. It is by default also physical damage, so it scales the same way as the rest of your stuff. Enhanced Corpse Explosion is just kind of nice because it increases the radius. But the real nice perk for us here is the Plagued Corpse Explosion, because this makes Corpse Explosion deal more damage to enemies that are slowed, stunned, or vulnerable. As I said, we very frequently have vulnerable on the targets, so this is something you will very consistently get as well, get the bonus damage from that. The other ability here is Blood Mist. Now, to be honest, I very rarely use this because it's essentially just a safety switch that makes you immune for 3 seconds and gives you 20% movement speed and a little bit of self-heal. Now, most of the time that just didn't feel necessary because you're just shredding through enemies and even bosses way too quickly. But there are some exceptions, especially raid bosses, where sometimes you want to avoid certain attacks coming your way, and also where it can be very difficult to get corpses, and Blood Mist has a tool for that. The first perk just allows us to get the cooldown reduced by 2 seconds if you cast a skill that overpowers. But the second perk here, Blood Mist, leaves a corpse behind every 1 second. I actually had another perk in combination with that made them automatically detonate, which is kinda cool in theory, but not that nice when you don't want them to detonate, so I wouldn't actually recommend that perk for this build if you want to optimize it. So you can just get 3 corpses very easily and use them to summon skeletons or detonate them or whatever you need to do in that moment. There are other perks that provide you with corpses like, for example, Hued Flesh, but I found those to be less reliable overall than just going for Blood Mist and getting my corpses guaranteed when I need them. The only downside is that sometimes you may want to have the iframes in another moment, but really not that often that it was a problem for me. Now in the next row, Decrepify would definitely be a nice perk to have because of the slow, which gives you extra damage for your corpse explosions again, but I didn't really feel the need for it. You can go even further down, and one option here that I know a lot of people like, because I have read a little bit now, unfortunately after all, is Bone Spirit, which just gives you another skill that deals very high damage, that goes very much in line with the rest of the build. But then again, I feel like most of the time you're better off just using the essence for the spears and just consistently and reliably using that instead. So I'm not even the biggest fan of this. But if you want the upgrades, this is the path I would take, though this path could also be interesting to at least get some of the essence back. So far, none of the ultimate skills seem particularly appealing to me compared to what I have, but there are some other perks that are extremely nice. Ossified Essence allows your bone skills to deal 1% increased damage for each point of essence you have above 50 upon cast, so this is a massive damage increase. And basically all of the skills you can do down here for crit lead to this point, to Evulsion, which gives you extra critical strike damage against vulnerable targets. And since targets are always vulnerable, this is just a ton of extra damage stacked on top of each other. So if you commit deeply into these points, you can get a lot of use out of that. Another very nice perk collection to have is all the way back up where the core skills are. Here you can increase your essence with Unliving Energy, which also benefits those other extra essence damage perks, and also make your core skills cost more essence, but also deal more damage in return. This, I think, is just perfect for Bone Spear. The cost increase isn't that much of a hit, but the extra damage is going to be massive. There's a lot more that can be done here, but since we were locked to level 20 during the early betas, I didn't get that far in terms of build yet. And of course, once there is more, I will tell you. When it comes to gearing, some nice things that I've found so far are things that make you deal increased damage at a distance, as well as skills that make you deal increased damage when you use basic attacks and then use your core skills afterwards, because you're gonna throw some basic attacks to get your essence back while you're fighting, so that you can use Bone Spear again. What's particularly great is the perk that increases your damage while standing still. I have a little tip for you here. If you hold shift and attack, then you can actually stand still while ranged attacking. And through that, you can guarantee that you have this damage bonus up as long as possible. With this build, you can kill enemies that are off screen, so you really don't need to move much. Things will fall down from a distance, and this is even true for bosses. As I said, perks that increase vulnerable damage are great, and another perk that goes into that is also the Emerald, which gives you additional critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies, which can also be a useful additional bonus. Let's also have a quick look at our skeleton options. The first one here is our Skeletal Skirmisher, and the nice perk for this one is when you critically strike, the skirmishers also deal 50% bonus critical strike damage. This is something that happens very frequently with this build, so very reliable way to get some extra damage. The defenders aren't really something that I think is super good for this build, unless you just really need something to face tank. But the Reapers are also pretty nice, because you can either have the extra cooldown reduction against vulnerable targets, again, targets are always vulnerable, or you can have the carved flesh of enemies, which forms corpses, which you can utilize with your detonations. Also, you can use the perks on the side here, the sacrifice perks, especially for bosses. Increased critical strike chance is obviously very, very nice with this build, so no doubt there. And we move on to the mage options. Here I would prefer one over all others, and that is Cold Mages, because every time they attack with their primary attack, you gain 2 essence. I think this just outclasses pretty much everything else that you can get when it comes to utility for your own damage. So generally this is the perk that I would go for. The other perk here is also decent because it can make targets vulnerable, and the perks for sacrificing skeletons are nice too. On one hand, with the Shadow Mages here, you can increase your essence by 15, which again works with a perk later on that increases your damage with higher essence, so that's one option. Or you can just use the Cold Mages here and put your vulnerable damage a little bit higher with an 0.15 multiplier here. When it comes to golems, the Bone Golem could be an option if you want to have a taunt. This also comes with shedding corpses, which again you can utilize as well. Alternatively, I think the Iron Golem has quite a few purposes for you. Not so much with this perk, but especially with this slam attack that also makes enemies vulnerable, which stacks with everything else you do, or with this sacrifice perk, which gives you a 0.3 critical strike damage multiplier. Of course, some of these things may have changed since the last playtest, but overall a lot of this should still be working the same way. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more Diablo stuff, especially for the Necromancer, then consider subscribing and clicking the bell. I will be making more videos about this build in particular, but also other builds in the near future, once I've done some more testing on them. Thanks to my patrons for supporting this video, and thank you for watching. Duke Sloth, out.